Hello everyone, my name is Steve Wilson. I am a music instructor here at Cabrillo College, and I also am the director of the Kuumbwa Jazz Summer Camp. I've been asked to do some lectures recorded on music theory, and so let's get started. First of all, I'd like to point out that there's a really good website that you can use as a reference for the things that we're talking about here today. And it's called musictheory.net. Go to www.musictheory.net. It's also available as an app on your phone, so you can have it anywhere you want. It's got a lot of great things in it. It's got lessons, exercises, and tools. Now, the lessons will allow you to go through some of the things we're talking about here over again. The exercises will allow you to drill yourself on those, working on your scales, triads, and that sort of thing. It's a really good way to kind of, get some exercises. And then there's a thing called tools. And my favorite tool is called a staff paper generator. You can go there and you can just print out all the staff paper you want, so that if you want to take notes, write music, that kind of thing. So again, musictheory.net is a very useful tool for your study of theory. The next thing I'd like to point out is this is my email address, stwilson@cabrillo.edu. At any point during the camp, if you would like to contact me, ask me questions about the lecture material, about music in general, about performance, that kind of thing, just send me an email and I'd be happy to get back to you. So today we're going to start talking about some scales and some basic chords, triads. And we're going to start by talking about something called the chromatic scale. We have three different scales here today: the chromatic scale, the whole tone scale, and the major scale. Now, the chromatic scale is all half steps. Now, what is a half step? A half step is the smallest distance that we recognize between two notes in Western music. When I say Western music, I mean music of Western civilization, coming out of Western Europe. This is the system of notation that we use, and it categorizes notes into half steps. That's the smallest distance we recognize. Anything smaller than a half step, we call it out of tune. Now keep in mind that in other parts of the world, for example, Africa, parts of Asia, they divide the octave differently. It's something that you may want to look into. It's a very interesting study. Not everyone around the world divides the octave exactly into 12 parts the way Western music does, but that's what we do in our system. And so let's talk about this scale here. Think about your instrument, and for example, between a C and a C sharp on your instrument, that's a half step. Between E and F on your instrument, that's a half step. Between B and C on your instrument, that's a half step. Okay, so again, the half step is the smallest distance that we recognize in Western music between any two given named notes. So the chromatic scale sounds like this. I'm going to go to the piano and I will play it one note at a time for you. Okay, there are 12 notes in the chromatic scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then we get to the octave. By the way, one thing that you will discover about any scale, typically they begin and end on the same note an octave higher. A scale is essentially a way of spanning an octave and filling it in with a certain number of notes. We can do it with 12 notes. We can do it with a smaller number of notes. So once again, these are a half step apart, and there are 12 of them until we get to the octave. Okay, so the chromatic scale has 12 notes. By the way, there's only one chromatic scale. Think about it. The chromatic scale that starts on C is the same scale that starts on C sharp. If I put a C sharp up here, I would basically have a chromatic scale, but just in a different starting point. So there's only one chromatic scale. It has 12 different starting points, but it's the identical scale no matter where you start. Now the next scale is something called a whole tone scale. Half step is sometimes also called a half tone. A whole tone is two half steps. So in the case of this scale, we have all whole steps, okay, or whole tones. So from C to D is 2 half steps or 1 whole step. From C to E is 2 half steps or 1 whole step. E to F sharp is 2 half steps or 1 whole step. F sharp to G sharp is 1 whole step, 2 half steps. To A sharp is 1 whole step, 2 half steps, and then back up to C. Again, we have the octave here. And we span the octave with 6 notes instead of with 12 notes. Makes sense. Half steps, whole steps, 12, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we're back at the octave. So let me play the whole tone scale. Okay, now I said that there's only one chromatic scale. Think about how many whole tone scales would there be? Give yourself a second. If you answered 2, that's correct. There are 2 whole tone scales. Because think about this. The whole tone scale that starts on C is the same as the one that starts on D. If I put a D up at the top here, it would be exactly the same. Is the same as starts on E. So all of these named notes here in the scale could be the beginning of the scale. The C whole tone scale is the same as the E whole tone. It's the same as the F sharp and so forth. So there's one other whole tone scale that starts on C sharp, okay, or starts on D sharp, or starts on F. But there's only 2 whole tone scales, and they take up half of the notes that are possible. Once again, all of the notes, half of the notes. Okay. Now here's a thing about both of these scales. The chromatic scale and the whole tone scale, they're very interesting and colorful sounding scales, but they don't have a sense of gravity to them. And that's because all of the notes are equal. In this particular case, all the notes are a half step apart, and therefore they're all the same. All the notes here are a whole step apart, so they're all the same. So let me play you a little melody using the chromatic scale. So I'm just going to start on the beginning of the chromatic scale. You get the feeling that you could stop anywhere because none of the notes are any different or more important than any of the others. They're all equal. They're equidistant to one another, and therefore they are equal. Same thing with the whole tone scale. Sometimes the whole tone scale, if you've ever seen a sitcom on TV, very often when they go to the dream sequence, they go. And there's a feeling kind of floating. So the whole tone scale and the chromatic scale sort of create a sense of floating in terms of notes being more important than one another. All the notes are equal, and therefore there's no center. There is no what we call tonality. Now, tonality is a term that refers to kind of a feeling of gravity or pull to one particular note. The last scale here has tonality very strongly, okay? Now, if you look at this, this is the major scale, and I assume you're all familiar at some level of the major scale. The major scale has a half step between, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 notes, and then the octave. Now, between 3 and 4 is a half step. Between 7 and 8 is also a half step. Everything else is whole steps. So two half steps or 1 whole step. 2 half steps or 1 whole step. Half step. 2 half steps or 1 whole step. 2 half steps or 1 whole step. 2 half steps or 1 whole step. And then a half step at the top. Now this creates a situation where the notes are not all equal. Some of them are related by a half step to their neighbor, others by a whole step. And it sets up a kind of a hierarchy of notes where one of the notes is more important to the ear than the other notes. And that is the starting and ending note, which is called the tonic. Now the tonic of any major scale or major key is going to be the name of the note that starts the scale. Now what you're going to see is that I'm going to play this scale for you. When I get up here, I'm going to stop on the B and hold it for a second, and then I'm going to resolve it up to the C. The B is what we call the leading tone, being a half step away from the tonic, and it creates a sense of pull, of a tonal pull that goes to the tonic. It's called the leading tone, as I said, and it leads your ear to the tonic, and it creates a sense of tonality, something we did not have in either one of these scales here. So I will play the major scale. I will stop on the B temporarily, and then I will resolve the B to the C. You can clearly hear that sense of tonality. Now, if I make a melody on a major scale, there is definitely a pull from the other notes to the tonic or to the C. And most of the music that we play and compose and so forth has a feeling of tonality. And the major scale is the most commonly used scale in Western music to create pieces of music. There's lots of other scales. There's minor scales, at least 3 of them. There's other what we call modes, and there's various other scales that you can study at another point. But understanding the major scale is very critical. If you want to write a piece of music in a particular key, you use the major scale for that key, C major in this case. You use the major scale for your melodies, and you harmonize the scale to get the chords, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. And that's how we create a piece that's in a particular key. Now, I would suggest very strongly, no matter what your instrument is, that you learn all of your major scales. Okay, this is only one of the major scales. There are 12 different major scales. Okay, if you think about the chromatic scale as all of the notes in Western music, each one of them is associated with a major scale. So you can have a C sharp, or you can have a C major scale. You could also have a C sharp major scale, which is also sometimes called the D flat major scale. You can have a D major scale. You can have a E flat major scale, which sounds like a D sharp. You can have an E major scale. You can have an F major scale. You can have F sharp major scale or a G flat major scale. You can have a G major scale. You can have an A flat major scale, is generally the scale that we use off of this particular pitch. You can have an A major scale. You can have a B flat major scale, which is the one that we use off of this pitch, and a B or a C flat major scale, and then back to C here. Now that's a total of 12 major scales with 15 different notes, or different names. If you look up all the different scales, what you're going to see is that there are 15 names, but they really only refer to 12 specifically different scales. This is not part of this particular lesson, but if you're interested in pursuing this more, look up the circle of fifths. You can find it online someplace or in any theory book, and it will give you a description of the relationship between all of the 12 major scales and the 15 names that are associated with those. And it's a fascinating study. Now, if you are an instrumentalist, you need to learn your major scales on your instrument, every one of them. Now, if that seems like a lot, what I suggest you do is break it down and maybe start with the C major scale and spend a week learning the major scale in all the octaves of your instrument. Go down as low as you can and as high as you can and completely learn that scale on your instrument. The following week, continue with the C major, but add the F major scale. Okay, so you have 2 scales. Another week, you add another one, say the B flat major scale, and so forth. In 3 months, you'll have all of your major scales learned on your instrument, and that will make you a much more competent musician moving forward. Trust me, it's very, very important. Another thing that I would highly recommend to everyone is that you learn some piano. Okay, even if you're a horn player, guitar player, bass player, what have you, learn a little bit on the piano. You don't have to be great, but good enough that you can play melodies and maybe play a little bit in both hands and be able to play chords, that sort of thing. The reason is that understanding theory is easier on the piano or on an electric keyboard, that was fine also, than on other instruments. On a guitar or a horn, it's just more abstract. The piano, everything to the left is lower, everything to the right is higher. It's just easier to see the relationship between the pitches, and learning music theory is much easier if you have some skill on a piano or on a keyboard. Now the other thing, you may notice that everything I've done up here and will continue to do in these lessons is in the treble clef, okay? Now the treble clef is the most standard of the clefs. And that's the reason I do this. If you are a bass player or a trombone player, you probably, you know the bass clef better, okay? And you need to learn the bass clef very well to play those instruments. But I would highly recommend, as a trombonist myself, I would highly recommend that you learn the treble clef, because there's a lot of times that there's information out there that is only given to you in the treble clef, and you need to be able to access that. Not everyone writes things out in the bass clef. Where you're going to find that, go to musictheory.net and look up the treble clef, study the treble clef, so that you can follow these lessons and future studies. And, you know, there's a lot of times you might be at a jam session and there's a fake book there, and there's only a fake book in treble clef. So I highly recommend that you learn the treble clef so that you can, you know, study music a little bit more. Okay, so just take a look at these scales one more time. I'm going to erase this and move forward into talking about some simple scales, or simple chords, excuse me. So we're going to begin talking about triads. Now, a triad is a 3-note chord, all right? So there are 4 different types of triads. There's what we call a major triad. And a major triad is 1, 3, 5 of a major scale. Now, one of the reasons that I really emphasize learning those major scales is that not only does it allow you to get around on your instrument much, much better, but it allows you to start spelling chords, triads, 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords. By using the major scale, we can find the notes of a chord. Again, there are 4 types of triads, and the first one is a major triad, which, as I said, is 1, 3, 5 of a major scale. The next one is a minor triad. And that equals 1, flat 3, 5 of a major scale. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, why don't we use a minor scale for minor triads? Well, first of all, there are at least 3 different types of minor scales, and that gets confusing. Which scale are we going to use, and so forth. I just find that the major scale is a really consistent yardstick or ruler that can be used to figure out any kind of chord. Major, minor, or any other type of chord can be used to find the notes of that chord by using adjustments like this. We call this the flat third. Now, first of all, the term flat third is commonly used. It means to lower the third note by a half a step. Now, sometimes that means putting a flat on it. Sometimes it means taking a sharp off. But people often will say flat 3. And what they mean is lowered by a half step. So I'm going to give you examples of all of these in a moment. But keep in mind, the minor triad is going to be 1, flat 3, 5 of a major scale. Then we have something called an augmented triad. And that equals 1, 3, and a sharp 5 or raised 5 of major scale. So 1, 3 of the major scale, and you sharp the 5. You raise it by a half step. Okay, and in a minute I'll give you some examples of these. Major triad, minor triad, augmented triad, and then the fourth triad is something called a diminished triad. Diminished triad is 1, flat 3, flat the 5 of a major scale. So 1, flat 3, flat 5 of a major scale. You take any major scale, you take those notes, and you will get that triad. Okay, so to review this, a triad is a 3-note chord. There are 4 different types of triads. The major triad is 1, 3, 5 of a major scale. The minor triad is 1, flat 3, 5 of a major scale. The augmented triad is 1, 3, sharp 5 of a major scale. And the diminished triad is 1, flat 3, flat 5 of a major scale. Memorize those formulas, okay, because they will help you to create these chords as we go on. And again, the major scale is absolutely critical. You need to learn those major scales at some point so that all of this will fall into place very quickly. Okay, so I'm going to erase this and give you some examples of each of these scales here, of these triads, excuse me. Okay, I'd like to mention that I'm going to be writing all these chords in starting note of C. That is to say that these are C triads. And this is just for the sake of this first lesson here, just to introduce what these triads are and the chord symbols associated with them. You need to learn them in all the keys, though, or at least most of the keys that are typically used in jazz, and we'll talk about that more at another point. But knowing them just in C is only going to be a starting point, but that's where we're going to begin today. Just know that you need to look at these in other keys as well. So let's go ahead and we'll start with a C major triad. 1, 3, 5 of the C major scale. And remember, that's the major scale that starts and ends on C with the natural notes. Now, I'm going to play this for you, and when we play chords, we can either play them like this, which means arpeggiated, which means playing one note at a time, or we can play it as a block chord, all 3 notes at the same time. Either way, it's the same chord. That's what we call a C major triad, okay? Now, I'm going to give you some of the chord symbols that are associated with each of these triads. In jazz and pop music today, we use a lot of chord symbols. Instead of writing out all of the notes, very often, instead of having these notes written out for you, you will have something that looks like this, a chord symbol. And the chord symbol will tell you what the notes, what chord is asked for. And then it's up to you to come up with some voicing for that particular chord. Now, in the case of the major triad, the accepted chord symbol that virtually everyone will respond to is the capital letter with the name of the chord, and that means a major triad. So if I just said F, that would be an F major triad, 1, 3, 5 of an F major scale. If I said B flat, that would be B flat, D, F, 1, 3, 5 of a major scale. If I wrote A, that would be A, C sharp, E, which is 1, 3, 5 of an A major scale. Okay, so the capital letter for the root of the chord is going to be the acceptable chord symbol for that. By the way, every triad contains 3 parts. It contains a root, it contains a third, and it contains a fifth. So when we look at these chords, we're going to say root, third, fifth. The root is the name of the chord. The third is the third note of the scale, the major scale from that chord, and the fifth is the fifth note from that scale. Okay, this is really the only chord symbol you need to know for the major triad. Capital letter with the root of the chord is acceptable. Now, the next triad is a minor triad. Now, a minor triad, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, was 1 flat 3 5 of a major scale. So if I flat the third by putting a flat on this, I have a minor triad, which sounds like this. The standard chord symbol for this is a little m. Okay, now there's some other ones there that I'm going to point out to you because you will see some other chord symbols that are associated with this. A dash means minor also. Back in the 1970s, this became very popular. I don't see it nearly as often these days, and I don't recommend using this chord symbol because not everyone knows what it means. But if you find an older chart in a fake book or something with a dash, that means a minor triad or a minor chord of some sort. Sometimes people will write MI, that's okay. Or MIN, takes just a little longer. All of these are indicators of a minor triad. So for example, if I had F minor, that would be F, A flat, C. That's 1 flat 3 5 of an F major, of the F major scale. If I wanted a B flat minor triad, that would be B flat, D flat, F. 1 flat 3 5 of a B flat major scale. And if I wanted an A minor, if you'll recall, A major was C sharp. I flat the third, in this case it means removing the sharp. A minor is a chord that has all natural notes, and it represents 1 flat 3 and 5 of the A major scale. So once again, here's what the minor triad sounds like. Here's a C minor, here's an F minor, here's a B flat minor, here's an A minor. Okay, so the next type of triad is called the Augmented Triad. An augmented triad, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, is 1 3 raise the fifth by a half step. So in the case of C, C, E, G sharp, raise the fifth by a half step. The chord symbol that I prefer, and most people, I believe, prefer for this is a C with a plus. The plus means raise the fifth. Some people will say C, aug. You will see that from time to time. It's a little awkward, but if you see that, it means the same thing. It means an augmented triad. But I think this is the one you'll be more likely to hear or to see. This is what an augmented triad sounds like. Here's that raised fifth, root third, raised fifth. So if I wanted an F augmented triad, or if I did that, it'd be a fog chord. I would probably use the F sharp 1 3 raise the fifth. That's an F sharp or an F augmented triad. B flat augmented triad. B flat, D, F sharp. And the A augmented triad sounds like this. Now let me take a moment to look at one of the notes here. You notice the E sharp here? You may think, what about E sharp? E sharp is the same note on the keyboard as F. So it's called enharmonic to F. E sharp and F are enharmonic. It means two names for the same pitch on the keyboard. Is it okay to call that an F? Well, yes and no. If I called that E sharp an F, somebody would play it and it would sound right. A, C sharp, F. But the E sharp tells me more what it's actually doing. In a theoretical context, E sharp is correct because the E sharp is the raised fifth. Okay, so it gets a little nitpicky when you get into theory. And sometimes people might write that as an F and it actually is functioning as an E sharp note. Not to make a big deal about that, but if you're in a theory class and the instructor asks you to write an A augmented chord, you want an A plus on your exam, you're going to write A, C sharp, E sharp. Okay, so that's the augmented triad. Okay, and the last triad is the diminished triad. The diminished triad is 1, flat the third, flat the fifth. Lower them, okay? So this is a C, and the most accepted chord symbol for that is a little degree sign, a little circle, okay? So that means C diminished. Some people write a D-I-M. That's okay as well. I've even seen a CD. That I don't know if that's a compact disc or a certificate of deposit. That's a little misleading, but you will see that sometimes. Less so, and this is the most common one there. So 1, lowered third, lowered fifth, gives you a diminished triad, which sounds like this. Okay, so for the same other roots that we had an F. Diminished would be 1, lower the third, lower the fifth. And again, C flat, call it a C flat, don't call it a B, because it is the lowered fifth of an F diminished chord. And the fifth, it needs to be a C. B flat, D flat, F flat. Nobody likes F flat, but in the case of this, it is the correct theoretical note for that because it's the lowered fifth of a B flat chord. And then finally the A diminished. You lower the third from a C to a C sharp to a C, and you lower the fifth from an E to an E flat, and you have an A diminished triad. Once again, here's our diminished triad. Okay, so that is the basic triads. There's 4 of them. Once again, a major triad is 1, 3, 5 of a major scale. Minor triad is 1 flat, 3, 5 of a major scale. An augmented triad is 1, 3 raised fifth of a major scale. And a diminished triad is 1 lowered third, lowered fifth. Flat third, flat fifth. Okay, now before we go, I'd just like to mention a little bit about learning these triads by ear also. Learning them on your instrument, learning them on keyboard, learning them on sheet music, paper is all well and good. You also need to work on getting them into your ears, okay? And a good way to practice that is to get together with a friend and maybe play some triads for each other and trade off between who plays and who listens and identifies the triads. You can also go to musictheory.net. You can go to other online type of ear training programs and find different ways to memorize the sound of these. Each of the triads has a particular sound to it. So let me play them one more time. Major triad, minor triad, augmented triad, and diminished triad. Now, what you might say is the major triad and the minor triad both sound kind of stable, okay? They both sound like you could end a song on that chord, so C major or C minor. So here's C major, C minor. C major sounds a little brighter, and the minor sounds a little darker. There's a feeling that you can end a song on that Now, in the case of the augmented and the diminished chords or triads, there's something about them that sounds a little unsettled, like they're unresolved, like your ear wants them to go someplace. Here's an augmented triad. You hear that, and it doesn't sound like the end of a song. It sounds like it's going somewhere. It sounds like your ear would like that chord to resolve. It's a little less stable, if you will, than the major or the minor triad. And the same thing for the diminished. It has a darker sound to it than the augmented, but it also doesn't sound like, it sounds like you're kind of wanting to go someplace. So once again, major, it's kind of bright and resolved. Minor, a little darker, but still sounds resolved. Augmented, kind of bright, feels like your ear wants it to go somewhere. And diminished, you also feel like you want it to go someplace. It's a little bit darker sounding. So work on those, work on them on some sheet music paper, on musictheory.net, on a keyboard, and get used to those. Okay, that's the end of today's lesson. Next lesson, we're going to talk about the harmonized scale and functional harmony. And that's where we take chords and we put them into keys and chord progressions and start to see how they work together in tunes.